On the 17th of March, 1912, Lyda Southard married her first husband. His name was Robert Dooley. The couple moved in together, living in an Idaho ranch with Robert's brother. By all accounts, they seemed to be a pretty happy couple. And before long, Lyda gave birth to a daughter, Lorraine. A tragedy struck when Lorraine suddenly died. According to Lyda, her 1-year-old daughter had gotten sick from drinking contaminated well water and had quickly passed away. It was 1915 at the time, and tragic stories like these were not uncommon. Nobody thought anything of it other than feeling sorry for the young mother who had lost her child. That same year, Lyda had bad luck doubled, and then tripled. Her brother-in-law, Edward, passed away within months of Lorraine's death. His cause of death was determined to be bacterial poisoning, which would now be called food poisoning. Again, this turn of events didn't raise any eyebrows. Antibiotics were still more than 10 years away from being discovered, so something that would be as mild as an illness today could even kill a healthy adult man in 1915. For a few months, all Robert and Lyda had left was each other. Then on the 12th of October, 1915, Robert caught typhoid fever and never recovered. For the first time in her life, but not the last time, Lyda was a widow. The struggles of being a widowed woman in the early 1900s were easily cushioned by money, and Lyda now had a lot of it, after cashing in on the life insurance policies of 3 dead family members. Less than 2 years after Robert's death, Lyda met William G. McHaffel, and in June 1917, she got married for the second time. Lyda sold Robert's property and used the funds to move herself and her new husband to Montana. Once again, tragedy struck. They had been married for less than a year when William suddenly became seriously ill, complaining of diarrhea and fatigue. He never recovered from his illness, and on the first day of October 1917, Lyda was widowed once again. Possibly this pattern might have raised eyebrows today. 2 dead husbands, a dead daughter, and a dead brother-in-law might have been enough to warrant some type of investigation. But this was 1917. The Spanish influenza was at its peak, and people all over the country were falling victim to serious illness. There were more dead bodies than there were doctors to carry out an autopsy, and William became just another statistic. His cause of death was recorded as diphtheria and influenza, and nobody thought to look into it any further, apart from Lyda, who was quick to cash in on her dead husband's life insurance. At this point, the story sounds eerily familiar with another serial killer story from the late 1800s, H. Holmes. In 1919, Lyda married again. Just like her marriage to William McHaffel, the union lasted just months. Lyda's new husband, a car salesman named Harlan Lewis, started experiencing the same symptoms that William had just a couple of years prior. His cause of death was determined to be gastrointestinal infection, and, more importantly, he had a hefty life insurance policy, 10 times greater than William's. Lyda pocketed $5,000 and set off to find her next unfortunate husband. Now referring to herself as Anna Mae, and still using her dead husband's last name, she started dating a local man named Ed Meyer. Ed was perhaps the most unlucky of Lyda's husbands. He only survived 1 month of marriage before dying suddenly. While Lyda's string of suspicious marriages continued, only one person was paying attention to the fates of her husbands. Earl Dooley, a relative of Lyda's first husband Robert, didn't believe her story for a second. He was a chemist, and he had suspicions about the real cause of death, and he intended to confirm them himself. Earl traveled to the farm where Lyda and Robert had lived and scooped up a sample of the soil from the area where Robert had supposedly died. It's not clear whether Earl had truly expected to find answers in the soil sample. Years had passed since Robert's death, and there were plenty of ways to kill a person that would never be detected in the soil. Regardless, he got lucky. The soil sample tested positive for a poison. To confirm his findings, he got another chemist and a nearby physician to look at the results. Both of them agreed that the soil contained large amounts of arsenic. As a chemist, Earl knew all about arsenic poisoning. He knew that the symptoms, diarrhea, Abdominal cramping and weakness perfectly mimicked the symptoms of other illnesses: gastroenteritis, which had killed Harlan Lewis, typhoid, which had killed Robert Dooley, and diphtheria, which had killed William McCaffell. Even though all of Lyda's husbands had been determined to have died from different causes of death, they'd all experienced the same symptoms, and every one of those symptoms could be caused by arsenic poisoning. Earl knew that if you wanted to secretly kill somebody, arsenic was an easy way to get away with it. It didn't have any of the bitter taste or smell of other poisons, and it could be easily concealed in a glass of water, stirred into a meal, or something like that. One of the easiest ways to get your hands on the poison without suspicion was by boiling or soaking sheets of flypaper, which contained large quantities of arsenic. With test results in hand, Earl went straight to a prosecuting attorney, Frank Stephen. And Frank was concerned about the findings and ordered Robert Dooley's body to be exhumed and then tested for the poison. The results came back quickly. Robert had consumed an amount of arsenic that would be fatal to 5 grown men. This was more than enough evidence to arrest Lyda, but when a sheriff arrived at her property, there was no sign of her. However, Lyda had failed to hide an incredibly incriminating piece of evidence. Inside her home was a large barrel full of water and flypaper. She was already preparing for her next dose of poison. With Lyda still unable to be tracked down, there was time to exhume more bodies. The rest of her husbands and brother-in-law all tested positive for arsenic. In fact, the only potential victim who wasn't clearly poisoned was Lyda's daughter, Lorraine. Possibly her death was a tragic accident, but more likely the small amount of arsenic required to poison an infant just wasn't detectable at the time. 8 months after her last husband, Ed, was murdered, authorities finally tracked Lyda down. Incredibly, she had once again gotten married. Her husband, Paul Southard, was an officer in the Navy. Even though Paul was, by all accounts, lucky to be alive, he didn't recognize the danger that he had been in. In fact, he was in love with Lyda and didn't believe that she was a murderer. By the way, I didn't mention this at the beginning, but Lyda was very attractive, so of course she couldn't be a murderer. She moved back to Idaho, where a 6-week-long trial began. For some reason, she only faced charges for her most recent murder. She was never charged with killing Robert or Edward Dooley or her daughter Lorraine, or any of her subsequent husbands before Ed Meyer. The results were disappointing to many people. Lyda was only convicted of 1 count of second-degree murder and received a minimum sentence of 10 years behind bars. Nobody was more disappointed than Lyda's most recent husband, Paul. After the guilty verdict, the reality of the situation began to sink in, and Paul made the incredibly wise decision of filing for divorce, becoming the first of Lyda's husbands to survive their marriage. Prison didn't reduce Lyda's ability to charm men. A prison guard became infatuated with Lyda and smuggled in extra bedding and a table at her request. She wrote letters to another inmate, David Minton, who also fell in love with her. After David was released from prison, Lyda sawed the bars of the window off of her cell and used the extra bedding to lower herself to the ground where David was waiting. David quickly became aware that he was used by Lyda when she left him to marry a rich widow, her 6th husband. As revenge, he turned Lyda in, and it was just as well. Shortly after she moved in with her new man, his mother caught a mysterious illness and passed away. Before she had time to commit yet another murder, Lyda figured out that authorities were onto her. She ran away to Kansas and tried to disguise herself by dyeing her hair, but police soon apprehended her. Her second stint in prison was also a short one. After being paroled, she was issued a full pardon. This left Lyda a free woman, and what else was she going to do but get married again? Her next husband, Hal Shaw, was married to Lyda for 2 happy years before he mysteriously vanished. To this day, nobody knows what happened to Hal. Lyda died in 1958 after having a sudden heart attack, and she was buried near not 1, but 2 of her murdered husbands. Her autopsy showed that her entire body was completely hairless, a side effect of spending so many years being exposed to large amounts of arsenic. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and thank you so much for listening today. And quickly, before you have a chance to follow through with what you're thinking right now, ladies, I'm specifically talking to you. There are better ways to remove hair. That last part of the story, I know you were thinking it. Don't do it. There are so many other options for hair removal. Arsenic is not the answer. Arsenic is going to be a trending self-care tip next week on TikTok. Because people don't care about their health sometimes. They'll just do wild things they think might help them a little bit. All right, so if this is your first time listening to 10-Minute Murder, I hope you enjoyed the episode. But please subscribe now wherever you're listening. You can catch up on all the back episodes and never miss any of the new ones. Connect with me on social media. See the visuals of what we're talking about here in the podcast. It's never anything gross and graphic, but just faces and places that you hear about here on the show. And if you like this episode, please leave a rating and review on Apple or any place that's possible. Your positive feedback helps this show grow so much. Go to 10minutemurder.com for all things related to 10-Minute Murder. Thank you for listening. And FYI, Flypaper no longer contains arsenic. Good night.